So um, looking forward to just talking a little bit about some of the background to all this excitement and hoopla about AI. It seems like it's each time you think it's going to quiet down a little bit, something new comes along. So the last 10 years have been a very interesting upswing. Though historically, it's been a much more rocky road. If you worked in this area of the year, you find that in fact, huge downswing when everybody basically no funding and it was very difficult to do stuff, and then it would come back up again. Okay, so
Oh, okay. You pointed toward sort of the television up here in front of you.
oh, okay, there we go. Right. Yeah. Okay, so really early on, there were actually quite a few interesting projects done with terms of calculating risks of diseases. This is a little description of a number of studies. In fact, some of them go way back to the 1950s. And this was a hollow-ribbon punch card machine, which you could use actually for doing differential diagnosis. And they looked at hematological disease. And it was basically kind of a card system with holes in the cards, and they dropped down. So that was a very early system, which I saw an example of when I was a medical student. And then going forward, you saw people starting to use very early computers. This is the early EDAC, which is a system which was developed really one of the very earliest sort of mechanical computers. This one actually had bugs, real bugs in it. And so one of the very first diagnosis programs, this was actually for carcinoma of the lung, and they looked at factors that were present or absent in both patients that had the disease and patients that didn't have the disease, and then did some calculations, essentially sort of multiple linear equations, which took, I think it was 9.5 hours on the primitive old computer then, but it was one of the very early ones. And then moving forward, things started to get more sophisticated. And so this is a system that was originally developed in the late 60s, and this is a study from 1972. And what was happening there was that Tim DeDomble, who was a surgeon, was very concerned about high missed appendicitis rates and high rates of perforated appendicitis in the UK. And so decided to build a system which is based on simple Bayesian method. So if a symptom was present in a certain disease and not present in the patient not having the disease, you could calculate from a data set the probability of that disease by taking the original chance of having the appendicitis and then adding higher probabilities as you go forward with these different symptoms and or lower probabilities. And we'll come back to that a little bit later. But essentially, it was a very simple algorithm. You could run it on the simplest calculator today, but it was relatively accurate. In fact, you could get significantly better accuracy on a number of diagnoses. And it's actually a system that I first got to use as a surgical medical student. And we got really interested in this idea. They did a randomized controlled trial, multi-center trial in the 80s, showed that it significantly reduced perforated appendix rate. But it was ahead of its time, and unfortunately, Tim DeDomble died of a heart attack during that process, and it sort of just went away. But actually, it today still has some of the best results. So it was an interesting example of how relatively simple ideas that are really well integrated into clinical care can make a difference. It's not just how clever your algorithm is; it's really a lot about things that really make sense in a kind of clinical context. Right, struggling with this one. So another thing I'm sure you've all seen are these risk scores. So before we had mobile apps, a lot of the time people would actually create a scoring system. They might use something like logistic regression, and they would calculate, for example, 10-year risk of cardiovascular disease, or in this case, risk of stroke in patients with atrial fibrillation. And so then from those, you calculate some simple scoring systems. You maybe have 1 point for this age, 2 points for an older age, and so on. And then you'd add this up on a little piece of paper. And when the score came out at the bottom, you decide, well, did this patient need anticoagulation? Or, for example, the one that we used a lot for many years, does the patient have strep throat as opposed to a viral throat infection? And there are many examples of these. And the problem, of course, is that they're a little bit time consuming, but they're also very simple, and they don't really pick up things like the more subtle differences in age or any of the kind of more subtle changes that could give you more accurate results. And so clearly it's something that we've sort of moved on from with EHRs and mobile apps and so on. So then the next sort of step, which was sort of took for, was called the rule-based systems, or sometimes expert systems. And so those were really designed to capture the knowledge of experts. And so, for example, a specialist physician would spend days, weeks, maybe going through these interviews and developing all these rules. And the rule would say, if the patient has this symptom and this test result, then this particular diagnosis is more likely. And you chain all these rules together, and then eventually you have a system that would diagnose patients. And sometimes it worked, but it was very fragile. Little changes in things, little changes in the way the patient was presenting a problem, and it could take a really long time to do this. So it kind of worked, but had its problems. The best example was a thing called mycin, problem that we look at so much today. How do you manage sepsis or potential sepsis? And so Ted Shortliff at Stanford in the 70s developed this very successful expert system that asked questions about the patient's condition in terms of whether they had any particular risk factors for disease, and then you go into the detail. Bring up here so I can see more detail. It's a little far away. But anyway, the last question was like, does the patient have a persistent headache or other neurological symptoms? Trying to obviously look at whether the patient might have meningitis. And then this information was put together and produce a recommendation for whether the patient required treatment, and if so, what kind of antibiotics or what other investigations were needed. So it was never really used clinically, but it did outperform the Stanford ID faculty. So that gave a lot of kudos. And it kind of led to a big explosion of work in this area for a while. But it didn't kind of stick. So there were a number of challenges. Probably it took a very long time, about 30 minutes to use it, which obviously wasn't going to work well for most people. It was very kind of specialized. It wasn't very helpful for, say, a primary care physician or an ED physician to get quick advice on something. So then the question was, who use these tools for doing diagnosis? And so the big excitement in the early to the 70s and into the 80s of building diagnosis systems, and people spent literally thousands of person hours collecting all the information about different diagnoses and producing these tools which would give you advice on the differential diagnosis of the patient. The two of the best known ones were Internist, which is University of Pittsburgh, and also DXplain at Mass General Hospital. And that's it. DXplain is still kind of used, or at least it was until recently. You plug in a whole bunch of information from the patient, and sometimes I think from the EHR could pick up that data as well, but you then get a list of diagnoses. And it wasn't all that accurate, but it could sometimes give you ideas about patients with different problems. But it never really kind of got too far. And so it's sort of that point was one of the places where people were disillusioned with AI and kind of got beaten down for a while. There was no funding. But at the same time, in the 70s, people started order entry systems. So there, obviously, they're more directed to which medications you're going to prescribe and what were the constraints in terms of what dose you would use, whether there are contraindications due to allergies or adverse events, or if the patient was contraindicated because of that drug because of, say, renal failure. And that information you can plug into the system and actually work pretty well. People liked it, it was a bit quicker, you could do repeat prescribing more effectively. And it became one of the real success stories of health informatics. It is a rule-based system, but it's really simple. You just have lots of really kind of one-level rules that define the different aspects of risks and so on. And so, of course, these are very widely used, but they don't kind of do anything terribly sophisticated. And mainly what they have is a gigantic database of all the interactions between different drugs in different conditions. And of course, one of the problems we've learned from this is that these very simple systems are great when you have a handful of rules, and they become increasingly painful and impossible to use when you have thousands of them. Every time you try to do something. So it's become a real art to go through and try and prune these rules and try and decide with a sort of committee which ones we're going to keep. It was kind of a limitation of this. So then we're looking at the Bayesian method. And so one of the challenges of these early systems was they didn't really handle probability, the risk of particular diseases, patients well. And so Bayes' theorem was one of the ways to say this. We know the prevalence of particular diseases in this group of patients, and we know that these particular symptoms and lab tests and other findings will either increase or decrease our belief in that particular diagnosis. And so you can chain those together in a fairly clean way, and that's how the abdominal pain diagnosis works. But when you do this, you can work with small projects problems, but it doesn't always work for really big scale. And this is one actually was looking at an early system for figuring out whether a patient had actually got whether a woman high risk of having Down syndrome baby, and this was looking at alpha beta protein and the patient's age before we had good ultrasound and 3D DNA testing and so on. And so it used this simple method, but actually worked pretty well. It was used very widely in the world. Then the next step was, well, we can't really take this too much further because the data wouldn't give you very clear answers for more complicated problems. But then an invention came up called the Bayesian network, Bayesian belief network, and that was really one of the things that we use a lot today. And so what that does, it uses the benefit of all the nice clean mathematics for probabilities in Bayes' theorem, but you create a network structure, and so you add all different findings of the patient, what kind of disease they might have, what symptoms they have, and then you can also model underlying factors of the system, for example, or some other system, and then they're linked together by these probability links. So these systems are developed by a team of experts. They do a huge amount of literature review and search, and they also kind of look at all the different problems that can potentially limit the patient's, for example, cardiovascular condition and cardiac output. And so when you put these together, you can actually do both diagnosis, but also model some of the problems and maybe the treatments that are required for the patient. And so this is an example that I worked with back in during my fellowship in the 90s, for the heart disease program. And it was an early example of one of these systems, which had a cardiovascular model. So what you had here, well, so we have this cardiac output, blood pressure, sympathetic state, so how much much adrenaline there is, or how much stimulation of the sympathetic nervous system, and then also vascular resistance. And through that, you can then model whether this patient with potential heart failure has particular conditions. And it turned out to actually work pretty well. And we did a clinical trial of this, very early web-based interface during my fellowship. And what we were able to show was that when the resident physicians who were admitting emergency cardiology cases used this system, so they actually used it when they were on shift, when we looked at their diagnosis lists, the heart disease program had more correct diagnoses on the list. In this case, we're looking at the most serious life-threatening diagnoses, and so the HDB had a higher sensitivity for those than the physicians. But then if you combine their results, it was better still. So in theory, it should have been a way of really helping you make better diagnoses. It didn't actually get used clinically, but it did get tested clinically, which was good. Okay, so moving on to sort of the next step, really a lot of what's happening now is looking at questions of how we classify different problems or patient groups or whatever. And so using classification algorithms, we collect different data on patients and then try and determine which of the be a category of diagnosis or other kind of problem patient falls into. So here what we have is just a simple diagram. This is looking at data. So you have one measurement and then another measurement against that. And so if you plot that, you can see that those patients, it's not terribly clear, but they're blue triangles and mostly inside that loop, which would be our sort of decision boundary between what has a disease and what doesn't have a disease. And so some people fall in the wrong side of that boundary, and so obviously you don't get a completely accurate test result. So this is a very simple example. If you have 20 or 30 things you're looking at, it would be like a 20, 30 or 30 dimension model, but we don't have to think about it that way. But essentially what it's doing is saying, how do we build an algorithm that helps us separate out the different classes in that data without having to actually build it by hand? And so this is where application algorithms, things like logistic regression and then machine learning really come in, where you know what the correct labels of these examples, and then you can actually train the system to recognize whether a particular patient or case or problem falls into one category or the other. And so this helps us to then build simple support systems which can classify different groups. And so we did an example of that back in the 90s as well, looking at, for example, diagnosis of chest pain in the emergency department, and able to show that you could actually classify patients pretty accurately based upon their presenting symptoms and EKG data. And some of that work, which was also done at New England Medical Center, led to a system that was used in the Hewlett-Packard EKG machines that actually predicts the risk of myocardial infarction. So this kind of approach worked pretty well for very specific tasks, but they're kind of linear tasks where you, in fact, if you looked at this diagram here, it wouldn't be like a wiggly line, it would actually be a sort of a straight line that went between the tasks. And so simpler ones were quite easy to do, but they kind of had limitations at that point. And so one of the things we found was that if you were to kind of build a very simple example, then you could often make it clear what were the criteria that led to the decision. And so they were kind of interpretable results. On the other hand, if you use your backpropagation neural network, which is almost the standard version that was used in those days, you don't really get any idea what it's doing. It just tells you the result. And so that's like a black box algorithm. And so there are sort of pros and cons to that. Sometimes the black box algorithms work better, but you don't have that sort of feedback as well. So the development of neural networks with way back in like the 50s and 60s, when people first thought, well, let's pretend that we had a model of a neuron, and it has a whole bunch of dendrites. We feed data in the dendrites, that's kind of the middle diagram there. And then we add up results from all of those inputs. But when it reaches the cell body, and if it reaches a certain total threshold, then it puts an output. And this is kind of the idea of a neuron with the dendrites and the axon and so on. And so people model that, and they found they could use it for simple problems, linearly separable problems. But then a very famous researcher called Marvin Minsky, who was a world expert on the rule-based stuff, AI stuff, wrote a book which really kind of demolished the whole field. I think it was very famous, and everyone believed it. Just about that time, a number of people, including Hinton, the guy who won the Nobel Prize recently for work on neural networks, invented a backpropagation algorithm that let you build multiple layers. So you end up with what's called a multiple layer neural network, and that can represent much more complex data. And that was the moment when we started to move from really simple problems to being able to do much more. And this is the basis for all these kind of fancy things like the systems for X-rays and retinal scans and so on. And the whole kind of move into being able to classify images in all different ways. And that's been really one of the big success stories where we do have a lot of applications that have shown to work well. And unlike most AI, they've actually had clinical trials. And so we actually have some solid clinical data that these things will work in various situations. And there's still a lot more work to do, but the basic idea was that you had to build much more complex models, and then you could represent more complex things. But that invention back in the 70s and 80s took a really long time to work through. Part of that was because we didn't have anything like enough data, and our computers were incredibly slow. So this is where the really big change was in having very fast processors, these graphics processors that made NVIDIA the richest company in the world and all that. That was the piece you needed with much larger amount of data, much larger processing. And then once you did that, you could start to represent these complex things. And that was the big sort of step forward. So other things that were really important in the early days were diagnosis of EKGs. And this was one of the early success stories back, I mean, probably 30 years or so ago. We had reasonably good algorithms that would actually give you a diagnosis of many aspects of EKG findings. And so these tools do things like recognizing a certain change. So this is a patient who is probably getting a myocardial infarction. And so they have this abnormality on the right side, which is circled. And so then they would produce an algorithm which let you add this together. And, oh, it doesn't, of course, it did it perfectly when I had my machine. It's changed on the screen. Anyway, basically it measures the height at different points along the signal, and then it uses that to determine whether this patient has SD elevation. So I checked it just before we got up. Anyway, so the next step with this was what was called convolutional neural networks. So back in the 90s, when I was doing my original AI work, we had this course on computer vision. And part of what the focus was on a thing called convolution, which is that when the human visual cortex receives the information from the retina, it processes it in very specific ways, and one of which is that it has these center surround cells, part of a group of maybe maybe 9 sort of pixels, if you like, or that would be a large number, be like 16. The center part gets the signal, and then the surround gets a much lower signal. And this is a very good way of actually pulling out the shapes and lines and things. And the cortex does the very first processing. So it turns out if you build these neural networks with backpropagation, with huge amounts of data, which originally was mostly cats, I think was India. Was it cats they turned it on? And so I think it was, and they basically got all this data from the internet, fed it in, and were able to create convolution in the system. It actually invented it itself, if you like, from the way the data was actually processed. And so these convolutional neural networks then were able to recognize things in different images, and then you could actually take a system that was trained on various animal photographs and things like that, and convert it and adapt it to work on things like X-ray, which is interesting. But it was sort of the beginning of this architecture, which is partly designed by people and mostly developed from the data by feeding the right example. And so that's been a really big step forward, and has allowed us to do a lot of really exciting things. And we're seeing, especially with things like ophthalmology, some really great results. The ability, for example, to screen for diabetic retinopathy, just with a simple handheld device, often in low-income countries who don't have that kind of expertise as well. So there's a nice paper which I've listed here, which is called The 3 Epochs of Artificial Intelligence in Healthcare. They talked a bit about the different stages, and worth looking at, actually. It's not very long, but it has these 3 categories. So the first one is symbolic and probabilistic models. And then we have deep learning, so that's all the neural network side of things, and some other related techniques, like random forests, where you have lots and lots of little rules, but they behave a bit like neural networks. And then the third generation is they call it foundation models, generative AI, large language models, this whole group of new things. And this is where Amina is going to tell you about some of this work. But the main difference is that instead of classifying stuff, they actually generate new stuff. And I think for a lot of people, it was a bit of a shock when that happened, because it wasn't really obvious that the people who were toiling away doing the language processing thing were going to revolutionize the entire world. But because they were actually generating new content, it turned out that could actually do useful. And so that's where we are in this kind of newer large language model, ChatGPT kind of world. So building on some of the earlier stuff, but really doing things in different ways. So in the sort of standard machine learning, we call supervised machine learning, usually, you have a set of data and you know the correct answer. And you train the system with that data. And that produces information, a model of that information. So this is an example of different kinds of ways of training systems. So essentially, the main takeaway here is that when you train a model, you start off with data at the top, and these are 3 different ways you could actually train it. But you have to separate a training set and some kind of a test or validation set. So you train the model and then you test it on new data. The problem is that when you train the model, it gets really, really good at recognizing every single idiosyncrasy and every single wrinkle in the data. And then you try it on new unclassified problems or patients or whatever, it tends to do much worse. So what you do is you hold out some of the data, and once you've got it working really well in training, then you take it onto new data and you say, well, does it still work? Turns out that can give you a much better performance, but ultimately you have to then test it on completely new data from somewhere else. And only then can you start to be confident this actually might work generally well. So the biggest limitation of these models is that they typically don't generalize from the original data to new sites very well. And so you often have to keep testing. You may have to retrain it by giving it new data and actually giving the system a chance to learn new patterns, or just testing to see whether it actually is able to handle a broad range of things. And this becomes particularly problematic when we're looking at different patient groups and different, the questions of patients, who are older, younger, or different racial or ethnic groups, or whether there's difference between women and men, which you would see certainly in things like chest pain diagnosis, and so all those different groups potentially can be at risk if your data set doesn't represent a whole range of different patients and potential situations. And that's been obviously a real concern. So we use a number of metrics. I won't dig into it, but this is the ROC curve, and this is a really good way of totaling up the sensitivity and specificity of models at different thresholds and give you a sense of their overall performance. We often use this to compare models in maybe testing 2 different models on a test set. and say, well, this one works better, it's got a better ROC curve. That's a good indication it's a good model, but doesn't really tell you everything. Another thing we do is actually calibration. So if say you were going to predict whether a patient had a risk of cardiovascular disease, 10-year risk of cardiovascular disease, you want to see how accurate it was. No, the overall accuracy might be pretty good, but if in younger patients the probability is off, or older patients the probability is off, then although the overall performance is good, you can see that it's actually not working so well for some subgroups. So it's kind of a simple way that we look for some of these limitations that, the broad performance is good, but there are limitations within it. The other big problem with all this stuff is that once you say you're using a system that's going to be helping clinicians, nurses, other healthcare workers to manage patients, the model can do really great. It can come up with some really great answers. But then when it actually comes to the question of how do you use that information, it has to be displayed and communicated to clinicians. And the question then is, how do you do that? And how do you actually give people the best information? This turned out to be a problem that's really under-researched, and we need a lot of work on it. So you can come up with really great systems, but people often don't use them, or they don't really know how to use the output. This is an example of a system that's developed. Quite nice study, actually, quite a good study looking at risk of patients requiring ventilation who were admitted with COVID. And what it was doing is looking at this top there is the sort of higher level of risk, and then classifying which patients were correctly allocated to that group and whether they actually had serious complications or died. But the strange fish-like diagram in the middle, what it is showing is the red spots are the ones that actually died from COVID. And you can see that although there's definitely more on the right-hand end, that group stretches right across. And so, it's not perfect. This is what you see when the model is only partially accurate. And from a clinical point of view, you have to think, well, this might be helpful for me, but you still have other information. And so it becomes quite difficult to know how to communicate that. I have my time here. And so the last thing I was going to talk about briefly is diagnostic decisions. So how do we actually help to support diagnosis? And so a lot of work previously on that, which didn't work brilliantly, but more recently we started to see that diagnosis become a much more bigger concern. People recognize it's a very major, potentially serious adverse events and infections. And so one of the questions is how could we improve that? This is an example where people have started to say, well, let's use diagnosis directly to patients. So people have been Googling their symptoms for a long time. Now there are symptom checkers that let you help diagnose yourself or your family member. And this is one called Isabel, one of the early ones. And an early study just using made up clinical cases, which showed that there's a huge range of performance. Some of the best ones were 63% accurate, sensitive for the diagnosis, but the poor ones were about 30%. And physicians on the same data were given back. So we looked at a study system developed in Germany called Ada Health, which has this Bayesian network, and it actually works pretty well. Takes a reasonably good history, and they were interested in doing some research. So we actually studied this in Rhode Hospital, starting actually working with Megan Rainey about 5 years ago now, actually 6 years ago. And we were able to look at the performance of the system when patients used it before they were seen in the emergency department. And then we used that data to compare that with the final diagnosis from the physicians to see how accurate it was, and also got the data from the system and just gave it to 3 independent physicians who blind read that data to access some of the algorithms. So having done this study, it showed that ADA worked reasonably well in terms of diagnosis and triage accuracy. Then along came ChatGPT, so we're able to feed it some of this data. And it turns out that the studies on large language models like ChatGPT, very, very few so far have actually used real patient data. So it turns out this was actually a useful thing to do. And this is the basic idea. The patient is seeing, they use the ADA app, and then the emergency department visit, they would actually see the ED physician and then compare the diagnoses. And then the 3 physicians in the middle were independently reading the data. And this is the results we saw. So ADA is on the left-hand side, ChatGPT 3.5 and 4. This is a year and a half ago. WebMD, and then the 3 physicians, their mean performance. You can see actually was, ADA did reasonably well. 3.5 looked really good for diagnosis. ChatGPT 4 didn't do so well. And then what was really interesting was that 3.5 had really unsafe triage. So at much, much higher risk of triaging seriously ill patients to routine care. And so that was a real concern. And it suggested there was a real problem. And since then, we've done a whole bunch more research, working with a whole bunch of students, and also me has been working on this. We've seen a big, big difference where a system can come up with a really accurate diagnosis and a completely wrong triage, or sometimes the other way around. And the two things are not connected, which is really concerning. So finally, this is actually looking at very data with ChatGPT. And although ChatGPT performed reasonably well on diagnosis, the people who used it were less likely to use the information from ChatGPT than from a system like Ada. So again, this problem, how do we communicate data? But Mina, would you like to take it? So